Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of 247 DIY. Today we're jumping back in on my high mileage Forester. We have a bit of a suspension overhaul to do. The mileage is getting up there and we're going to be replacing all the struts as well as some related components. So stick around. So my original plan for this was when the vehicle hit 200,000 miles, if it was still running good, that's when I was going to go ahead and replace the suspension at all four corners. But as it were, plans didn't work out, and I have a rear driver's side strut that's decided to blow a seal. It's been leaking some of the fluid, and it's just not functioning properly. The biggest thing I noticed was, even though it seems like they wouldn't go hand in hand, the suspension, the ride quality has been very bouncy, but really harsh at the same time. Going over just smooth kind of lumps in the road, you can feel the car just keeps bouncing after you go over it. And then harder bumps in the road, it'll bounce, but it's super harsh. Like, it'll hit real hard and then it'll bounce. And I've been noticing it for, probably 6 to 8 months. It's been progressively getting worse. I'm usually under the car a lot, which is why I wasn't sure if it was a strut or not, because I'm usually checking all those things out on a pretty regular basis. But when it really got to the point where I was noticing the ride quality wasn't right, I got underneath and I took a peek, and you can definitely see the fluid on the dust boot on this strut here in the rear. And the other thing I noticed too is you can manually actuate the suspension here in the back. I'll show you that in a second, and it is all over the place versus the front. When you push down on the front with all your body weight, it's very firm. It doesn't really seem to move very much. But let me show you how the rear acts. So yeah, the suspension really shouldn't bounce like that at all. It should be firm, just like the front. And when I am pushing down on the rear, I can feel that driver's side goes down more than the passenger side. So definitely the rear two struts are a shot. So before we go ahead and get the Forester in the air, we need to access the top of the struts. And here in the rear, we got to do a little bit of disassembly. It's not a ton, but first thing we got to do is take out this spare tire cover. And we can go ahead and get rid of this side piece. And then we need to get rid of these foam pieces on both sides. Pardon my mess here, I keep a lot of stuff in the back. There's these little plastic retaining clips. There's one out of frame just right here, but there's one here. I already tried to get it off, and I just used one of these trim tools to get underneath, and I actually just snapped it off. Once I get this off, I'm going to take a look at it. I'll let you know if there's a better way to, maybe if it's not a pry fastener. I'm pretty sure it's just a pry up fastener. I don't know why they would design it like that, where it pretty much just snaps off. But let me try to get the one here in the front, and we'll take a closer look and see if there's a better way to get those off. Alright, so here's the clip that they use. I've never seen Subaru use this style clip before. I'm not really sure what's going on with this. I don't even know. It looks like on these little wings here that you would have to actuate it and press it, but when you press it, there's a little tab here that's in the way and it doesn't go anywhere. And yeah, I've never seen this one before, and I don't really know how that's meant to be undone, because it's not like you can get underneath there when the foam piece is in place. So unless there's some kind of special tool you're supposed to like slide underneath there, who knows. Worst case scenario, I can just order a couple more of these, because it does look like they just push down in and snap, and we can just replace those later on. We're just going to repeat the same thing here on the passenger side. And then there's just these two covers on either side. They just pop right out. And then both sides are exactly the same. Here I am on the passenger side. You could go ahead and remove this panel. It would actually just kind of flip up because the carpets are connected to the back of the seat here. But you don't really need that much room. You've got enough room with a socket on an extension down to come here and get the forward strut mount. as well as the rear here. Just kind of got to get around this plastic a little bit, but definitely doable without having to disassemble any more than you need to. And then getting access in the front is real simple. All you got to do is pop the hood. And you've got both front strut mounts right here in the engine bay, both very easy to get to. So let's go ahead and get this in the air. So we're going to go ahead and start here in the front. This is going to be the least amount of work. All we got to do here in the front is replace the strut. So we're going to start by removing the front wheels. Now, one thing that I would definitely recommend is if you're in here doing this job, replacing the strut, is to also go ahead and replace your front control arms. I replaced these about 1.5 years ago, so that's why I'm not worrying about it today. But we went with new front control arms and new Endlinks. So these are all nice and brand new. So we're just gonna be doing the struts. And before we can go ahead and actually start physically removing these strut mounting bolts, we need to disconnect 2 bolts on this side. On the forward facing side, there's a 12mm bolt here that holds your ABS sensor wire on, so we need to remove that. And here on the rear facing side, there's another 12mm bolt that holds your brake caliper line in place, so we need to remove that. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we are going to need to mark these bolts before we start pulling them out. The one we need to mark is this top bolt here. The top bolt is part of your alignment adjustment. It's actually a lobed bolt. You can think almost like a camshaft. I'll show you when it comes out. And you can orient it in a certain way and it will move the top of this strut portion. Actually, it'll push the knuckle in and out relative to the top of the strut portion here. So even though we are getting alignment, I want things to go back as close as possible. So I'm just going to mark essentially what straight up and down would be, and we'll know that that needs to go right back in essentially straight up and down. And then we're just going to go ahead and remove these 2 bolts. They are 19mm bolts with 19mm nuts. And because the suspension is in full droop, there's some pressure on these bolts, so you may have to get a little persuasive. Just be careful if you're going to be doing this not to hit your ABS sensor line. And there you can see that lobe on the bolt, and you can see how it gets wider or skinnier depending on how that bolt's oriented, and that's what pushes that knuckle in and out to give you alignment adjustment. So now we can lower this down a bit and move on to the engine bay. And once again, we're dealing with 12mm nuts here. And your strut will start to drop down through. There's enough in the way where it shouldn't just completely free fall, so don't worry about that. And with that, you should just be able to maneuver the strut right out of there. Before we get too far, let's go ahead and talk about what we're putting back in the vehicle. I jumped on Rock Auto for all of this one. Usually on like my W-Rex, I'll go with like performance aftermarket parts. But the Forester is just my daily driver. It really doesn't need anything fancy. So what we've gone with is just OE quality stuff here. Generally, when you're talking Japanese vehicles, you want to look for either Bilstein or KYB stuff for replacements, because generally speaking, those are the 2 manufacturers that made the original hardware for, in this case, Subaru anyway. I do believe KYB manufactured the original suspension components for this vehicle. I could be wrong, but either way, I know I'm going with a good brand that makes OE quality parts here, going with KYB. And this is the Strut Plus versions of these available right off Rock Auto. I believe all that means is it's just everything all in one piece. You don't have to get a separate shock and spring and everything. It's just all assembled and ready for you to throw in the car. It was a good deal too. I went ahead and purchased these last month, so I didn't run out of the deal, but KYB was offering a rebate. So with all 4 of these here, I ended up a little over $500, and that meant I was eligible for a $75 rebate, which is pretty cool, getting $75 back on a project that needed to get done anyway. And then over here we have some of the stuff for the rear. So we have our 2 lower arms here. They're complete arms with the bushings pressed in. It gets rid of a little bit of headache not having to press new bushings into the rear arms. Also living here in the Northeast, the rear arms that are on the Forester are super rusty anyway, so might as well throw some good metal on there. Now when it comes to the Endlinks, let's talk about Endlinks for a second, because this is the second time I've run into a little bit of an issue. Now you'll notice that there is a bit of a difference between these 2 parts. First, I noticed it was simply where the Zerk fitting goes for filling with grease. You can see is very different on these 2, but it's mainly the bushing here at the top. And you can see this is just a standard rubber pass-through style bushing you see a lot of times. And then this one, I believe, and we'll talk about this in a minute, why I believe it is a pillow ball bushing. You can see it's got these boots on there, wire clamped down, and everything's sealed shut. So I didn't check the parts boxes before I went ahead with this project, which I should have done so. It's just been sitting in boxes. I assumed they would be the same part. Functionality wise, they're going to be exactly the same. So I want to get this project done, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw both of these on. I'm going to talk about rear knuckle bushings in a second, but I ordered 2 bushings that weren't correct, so I'm just going to return those to Rock Auto for a store credit. I'm going to buy another Endlink, and whichever one is the matching one, we'll go ahead and remove the non-matching one and replace it with the one that I get in the future. Obviously, I won't film that. It's just going to be a quick swap in and out of an Endlink, so that's what we're going to do with that. Now, what I've gone with here, and these just came up as part of doing a lot of research. These are Siberian Bushings, rear knuckle bushings, and these are a 2-piece slip-in style rather than a press-in. I think it's going to make life a little bit easier in the rear, at least on assembly. Removal is still going to be a bit of a headache, and obviously we'll get more into that as we get into the rear end. But the reason why I settled on these is I couldn't find the right part number. And what I mean by that is, and you'll see all this in a minute, in the rear end, in the knuckle, there is a bushing that this part of the rear lower arm clamps to. And it is this style bushing right here, just a standard rubber press-in bushing. However, when you go on the part diagram and you look up the part number for this, a bushing comes up that looks very similar to this. Obviously a black bushing, not a blue one. This is just Mevotech style. Oh, and if I didn't mention already, the arms and the Endlinks, I went with Mevotech. It's the brand I used for the front control arms, because in the control arms they offer a corrosion resistant offering, which is nice up here in the Northeast. And so since I went with them before with the front control arms and I really liked the product, they fit really well, I just went Mevotech again in the rear. But anyway, back to what I was saying. When you punch the part number in, which should bring this one up, it brings up a bushing that looks a lot like this bushing. And then coming upon a lot of research, I did find this bushing here available on Amazon, and you can see there that it has that part number. But then also on Amazon is this bushing, and it's the same exact part number. So all I can assume is that Subaru went with this first for some reason on this generation of Forester, and then they switched to the pillow ball style here. I'm curious as to why, because this pillow ball style bushing was used on earlier Subarus and is now pretty much the standard for later Subarus. So I don't know why. It appears to be like 2010 to 2012. When you actually look up compatibility, this shows no compatibility, even though it's the same part number. which is weird. But anyway, all I can assume is that Subaru upgraded to this pillow ball style and they just did away with this one for some reason. But we're going to get into these rear knuckle bushings later on. I know that those are going to be a super big headache, at least to get the factory ones out. So let's go ahead and finish up the front end before we jump here into the rear end. All right, so now we're just going to go ahead and do the opposite of what we did before. Now the first thing you need to do, because you have two of these, is make sure these are oriented properly when you grab the first one. Make sure your ABS sensor bracket here is on the forward side and your brake line bracket on the rearward side. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold a nut in one of my hands and reach up over the fender just so that I can get that threaded on one of these studs and hold this in place. All right, so I've hand tightened all three nuts up in the engine bay. If your vehicle's not on a lift, you can go ahead and tighten those down now. But being on a lift, I can't really get up there, so I've just pushed this up as far as it'll go, and I've hand tightened them as much as I can get them. You don't want too much play because you're going to be messing with this here in a second to get it back on the knuckle, and you don't want to damage those studs having too much leverage. So now let's go ahead and re-bolt up the bottom. We'll get the bottom bolt in first because that doesn't need any specific orientation. And one thing I like to do, and your alignment shop is going to thank you later specifically for this top alignment bolt, is I just like to hit the portion of the bolt that goes through the knuckle and the strut bracket with a Scotch-Brite wheel just to get it nice and smooth, get all that debris and stuff that's going to really gum these up. And then of course, if you live in a rusty area, throw a little anti-seize on there. All right, and then remembering that alignment mark that we made needs to face straight up, we'll go ahead and throw the top bolt back in. Now I'm sure there is a specific torque amount for these strut bolts. I've never had issue. Anytime in the past I've had to undo and replace, strut bolts for any reason, for them coming undone, you just make them good and tight. They're a nice, solid 19 millimeter bolt here. You're really not going to hurt it too much. I mean, if you sat there and just hammered and hammered and hammered, I'm sure you'd screw up the bolt. But just use your head and just make sure it's on there good and tight. And in my experience, I've never had issues not following a specific torque amount for these bolts and nuts. And then we just have to reconnect our ABS sensor and our brake line. So give me a second, I need to finish up the other side. We'll drop this down a bit and we'll finish up on the three nuts that hold the strut mount in place. And to wrap up here in the front end, we're going to go ahead and torque these strut mount bolts in place. Now I know on the older Foresters, going back a ways, they were about 14 foot-pounds. I doubt that's changed too much. That's barely any, so I'm not even going to use a torque wrench. We're just going to give them a good hand tighten. And when that finished up, we'll go ahead and move on to the rear. Oh, and also don't forget, on the factory struts, there's these little dust covers that pop on top to protect the center nut from debris and corrosion. You can just pop those off with a pick tool or a small flathead, and we'll just place these on the new struts. And same as the front, we're going to get these wheels off first, and we'll move on from there. So I'm going to start by removing the Endlinks here. Now, in theory, especially if you do not live in a rusty area, you could get away with not replacing these. But keep in mind the bushings in these do have just as much mileage on them as the struts do. So it's good just to get some replacement rubber in there. Plus, I'm used to replacing fronts and older model Subaru rears, which is both ends are this style up here. they generally don't use this through bolt. This is kind of new when Subaru went to this multi-link suspension in the rear. But generally speaking, when you try to take the nut off the top portion here, it usually shears and snaps right off, or it'll start spinning and you got to cut it off with a Sawzall. So I'm just in the habit of always buying new Endlinks anytime you think you need to go ahead and remove them. But the bottom through bolt is just a 14mm nut and a 14mm bolt. And before we go ahead and worry about the top portion of this end link here, let's just go ahead and get this whole arm out of the way so we have more room to work. And the remainder of these connection points are all 17mm nuts and bolts. Now the top bolt here to remove your end link is another 14mm bolt. We're going to try to just zip it off with an impact. Usually that doesn't work because the ball joint inside here will start spinning. There is a provision to put an Allen key in the end of these so that you can then twist the nut without this spinning. But generally, if you live in these rusty areas, it's going to be impossible to get an Allen wrench in there. And even if you did, you won't be able to retain enough torque to break the corrosion free. So chances are we may just have to come in on this side with a Sawzall or a cutoff wheel and cut it right off. Yeah, so it's just spinning the ball joint in there. It came off a little bit, but not enough, so Sawzall it is. Alright, so that's a pain in the butt, but it's off. I'm going to jump to the other side, get cut up to this point, and then what I'm going to do is we're going to get these struts out of the way so I've got more room when working with attempting to get this bushing out. Alright, so now here we are in the rear. This is the driver's side. I apologize for the bad camera angle. There's really just not a good spot to put my camera. But you got two 14mm bolts that hold the top of the strut on. And in this case, unlike the front where there was enough stuff in the way, these will just fall right out, so just be prepared for that. Alright guys, so I apologize for skipping ahead. I went ahead and I removed these bushings. Now don't worry, I'm going to tell you how I did it. But I just kind of got in the zone, plus I had to open the garage door up so that smoke could come out. I'll explain that in a second. Get some fresh air, and it's just terrible lighting when that door behind me is open. So those are out now. Let me explain how I went about getting them out. So initially, I tried using some sockets and some bolts and some sleeves that you typically see people do. It's like the normal press out method. You have one on this side that's the exact diameter as the inner race for the bushing, a wider one on this side, a bolt, a nut, some washers, and when you tighten it down, it should pull it out. I just didn't have the right hardware on hand, and I didn't feel like running out to get stuff. So what I did was, this is basically your bushing in there, obviously after removal, but it sits inside the bushing surrounded by rubber. So it would be inside of there like that. So while those were in there, I simply used my torch here. You heat them up pretty good. There's not enough clearance where you actually can burn all that rubber out, but you heat it up for a while, get it good and hot, and that will weaken down the rubber enough so that you can, because if you see the inner sleeve sticks out a bit, you can just give it some smacks with a hammer and that'll push the sleeve right out.
Then you're just left with the inner race here. And all I did was, you can't really see, yeah, you can kind of see right there. I just took a Sawzall with a metal blade on it. I did a relief cut on the bottom, and I did a relief cut on the top. And these were the ends that were facing this way. And then I just took a small chisel and a hammer and folded the inner lips in. And then I took a larger chisel and just kind of grabbed the edge and smacked away with my hammer. And that just pushed the inner sleeve right out. So if you don't want to buy extra tools, a press kit, and all that stuff, you can get them out this way. Now keep in mind, if you did want to put the factory style press-in bushings back in there, you are going to have to buy a press tool. But once we get this all nice and cleaned up, it should be a lot easier to do than the removal, simply because of the rust and the corrosion that really kind of gets those in there. But like I said, we're going to be going with the polyurethane ones. So I want to just take a wire wheel. We're going to clean up the faces and the inside here, get everything nice and clean, and we'll pop those in. Alright guys, again, I apologize for skipping ahead, but once again, ran into an issue. These bushings that supposedly were supposed to fit this car, they were way too big. I was just barely able to like wrestle this one in there, but it was just in there so much it would just pop right out. Way too big for the opening here. So I know it's not exactly the right thing to do, and it's not pretty, but I just took a razor blade on my utility knife and I just cut them down until they were about the right size. They fit in there snug now. They fit like they should. I know when I looked on Siberian Bushings site, they had two versions of these bushings listed, and then when I put my VIN number in, it showed one is not compatible and one is compatible. However, their shipping times were a little delayed, and I didn't want to wait, so I jumped on Amazon, and this was the only one available on Amazon. I didn't see the other one available really anywhere other than Siberian Bushings website. So it almost makes me wonder if even if I had purchased that new pillow ball bushing, if that would have even fit in this knuckle at all. But this is what we're going to run in with for now. I'm pretty confident that these should be fine like this. I don't think it's really an issue. It's not like we had to mess with the inner portion where the sleeve sits, because that's what should rotate on your axis. That's what should do the moving. Your bushing shouldn't move at all. So there's enough material there. There's enough friction, and there's a good press fit with these. It should be fine. So the one thing you want to do with polyurethane bushings is you really want to make sure you have a lot of good lubrication. Like I said, this inner bushing is what should be moving. This is the part that should be clamped by your part, in this case the lower arm, and then that should do the turning inside of the bushing. So this is a Subaru part. This is Subaru's Niglube. Niglube. It's a little hard to find, but if you just do a Google search, most of the Subaru parts websites will have this. Lithium grease is what's recommended for this. When I was doing some research on this, it does most places that sell alternatives for this. They are lithium-based greases, so I couldn't find a definitive answer on whether this was lithium-based or not. But Subaru uses this for like brake slider pins. I purchased it when I did the clutch on this car because it's what's recommended for the throwout bearing. So when you're talking about parts that do a lot of sliding over time, specifically your throwout bearing, metal on metal, well actually I think in this car it's plastic on metal, but either way, I believe that this should be plenty fine and good to throw in here. It shouldn't dry up, and it should keep these bushings from squeaking. Alright, so now what I'm going to do, I kind of have a game plan how I want to go ahead with reassembling. Mainly what I'm thinking is it's going to be impossible to hold the strut in place and fish a bolt over the top to hold that strut there like we did in the front. You could always have a helper. I don't have a helper right now. So What I'm gonna do is we're gonna install this arm so that we can then use that to hold the strut in place. And we'll go ahead and just throw our sway bar links in there right now. All right, guys, I really couldn't do that and film and everything all at the same time. It was kind of a mess, but let me walk you through what I did. So I still went with the same method where we had this attached and we lifted it into position here. But rather than find these two bolt holes first, I kind of brought it down a little bit so that I could at least get this bolt through here. Once that was in there, I could get this one stud on, but this one stud would be way out here. So I was just able to use a pry bar up in here and then pull that stud around to go right in where it needed to go. Once you have that where it is, you just keep your upward pressure on the arm. And then I kind of put my shoulder right here so that I could feed a bolt through. I used a screwdriver, a large screwdriver from this side, so that I could square up that bushing and get it nice and centered, and then push the bolt through. So lastly, all we got to do is we got to cinch down all of our nuts and connect up our end link. So this is where I was talking about, where you can fit an Allen key in the end of the bolt, and that keeps the ball joint from moving while you tighten your nut down. And so there's that all wrapped up. Take care of the other side and we will get up in the rear hatch so we can tighten down these top bolts. And then it's real simple, guys. We're just gonna throw the two nuts back on here on the top, tighten them down, and we'll reassemble the rear end. I'll go inside. I gotta clean up my hands, wash up a bit. We'll take it for a test drive and see how it feels.
So with that, that's a wrap on this episode, guys. As you can see from my jacket and the salt all over the Forester here, it's been actually about a month since we went ahead and did the repairs and replaced the suspension on this, which is kind of a good thing for you guys, because I can say now that I've been driving on it for a few weeks back and forth to work, the suspension feels amazing. I can't say it feels like a brand new car because there are still, older suspension components, but it feels so much better than it did. Before we went ahead and replaced the struts, the suspension was actually really unpredictable, especially going around curves, bends in the road at speed over bumps. It would feel like the vehicle was kind of trying to walk all over the road and didn't want to really stay in a straight line. So that's vastly improved. The ride quality is great. It's not bouncy anymore. Just like the KYB information stated, the ride quality was a little harsh at first. It was a little hard, but that's just because all the components need to break in and wear in a little bit. Now I can say that the car feels great. It feels confident on the road. It feels planted. It feels really good. And I can say that in addition to the leaking rear strut that I knew I had here in the back, I took all 4 struts and I disassembled them so I could get those dust boots off. And actually the front driver's side strut as well had some of the fluid inside of the actual strut assembly was starting to leak out as well. So no doubt it needed a replacement, but everything's nice and refreshed now. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Feel free to leave a comment below. And if you're not subscribed already, please go ahead and subscribe. Thanks.